In the vibrant, sun-drenched Brazil of the 1970s, a name shone brighter than most: Ângela Dinizs. A socialite, known for her captivating beauty and liberated spirit, she moved through the elite circles of Rio de Janeiro with an intoxicating allure. Her life, a whirlwind of high society events and passionate affairs, seemed the epitome of glamour and freedom. It was an era of cultural awakening, where traditional norms began to fray, and figures like Ângela personified a new, audacious generation. But beneath the glittering surface lay a darker current, a tempestuous private life that would tragically converge with an obsessed lover. Born into a prominent Minas Gerais family, Ângela Dinizs inherited both wealth and a striking presence. From a young age, she defied societal expectations, embracing a lifestyle marked by independence and a refusal to conform. She was often seen as enigmatic, captivating, and sometimes controversial. Her personal choices, especially concerning relationships, pushed the boundaries of what was considered acceptable for a woman of her standing. This unwavering pursuit of personal freedom, however, would ultimately become a double-edged sword, attracting both admirers and intense scrutiny. Ângela's life was a testament to her adventurous spirit. She was a cosmopolitan figure, equally at home in the bustling streets of Rio as she was on the international social circuit. Her striking looks and sharp wit ensured she was always the center of attention. But beyond the public facade, she was a complex woman seeking true connection and purpose, often navigating the treacherous waters of love and loss. She yearned for passion, but also for respect, a balance that proved increasingly elusive in her relationships. Each decision she made was her own, for better or worse. By the mid-1970s, Ângela Dinizs had already been married 3 times, each union ending in divorce. These highly publicized separations, though common for socialites, underscored her refusal to be confined by conventional roles. She had 3 children, whose custody battles often played out in the media, adding another layer of complexity to her already public life. Her romantic history painted a picture of a woman unafraid to pursue love, even if it meant defying societal norms, and repeatedly facing heartbreak. This pattern of passionate but ultimately doomed relationships set the stage for her final, fatal encounter. It was in 1976 that Ângela Dinizs met Raul Fernando do Amaral Street, known simply as Doca Street. He was a wealthy businessman, charismatic and well-connected, a man who seemed to embody the kind of strong, protective figure Ângela might be drawn to. Their initial connection was immediate and intense, a whirlwind romance that quickly consumed both of them. Doca, though outwardly charming, harbored a possessive streak that would soon surface, gradually tightening its grip on Ângela's life. This relationship, begun in passion, would descend into a cycle of control and confrontation. Their romance was a tempest of highs and lows, marked by intense devotion and explosive arguments. Doca Street was deeply infatuated with Ângela, but his love quickly morphed into a suffocating possessiveness. He grew increasingly jealous of her past, her independence, and her social life. As their relationship deepened, Ângela began to feel trapped. The initial allure of Doca's strong personality began to fade, replaced by a growing fear of his controlling nature. Friends and family observed a troubling shift, noticing Ângela becoming more withdrawn and anxious. Seeking an escape from the relentless scrutiny of Rio society and the escalating tension in their relationship, Ângela and Doca retreated to the idyllic coastal town of Búzios. In the 1970s, Búzios was a charming fishing village transforming into a bohemian paradise, far from the urban chaos. They chose a secluded beach house, hoping that tranquility would mend their fractured bond. But isolation can sometimes amplify problems rather than solve them, and for Ângela and Doca, Búzios would become not a sanctuary, but the stage for their tragic final act. The peaceful facade of Búzios quickly crumbled for Ângela. Doca's possessiveness intensified in their isolated dwelling. Arguments became more frequent and more volatile. Friends later recalled Ângela expressing a growing unease, feeling increasingly trapped and desperate to leave the relationship. She confided in close friends about Doka's erratic behavior and her plans to end their affair. The dream of a quiet escape had morphed into a claustrophobic reality, where every beautiful sunset was overshadowed by the looming threat of their unraveling relationship. The tension was palpable, building to an inevitable climax. On the night of December 30, 1976, the simmering tensions between Ângela Dinizs and Doka Street reached a boiling point. An argument erupted, reportedly fueled by Ângela's firm decision to end their relationship and Doka's refusal to accept it. The details of their final confrontation remain debated, filtered through Doka's later accounts. What is clear is that the verbal dispute quickly escalated, descending into physical violence. The beautiful Buzios' night turned sinister, as their private paradise became the setting for unspeakable horror. The sounds of their conflict likely carried on the night breeze. In a moment of rage and desperation, Doka Street produced a firearm. What followed was a brutal act of violence that silenced Ângela Dinizs forever. She was shot 3 times in the head and once in the back, a clear indication of the ferocity of the attack. Doka would later claim self-defense, portraying Ângela as an aggressor, but the nature of her wounds told a different story. The shots echoed not just through the quiet Buzios' night, but would reverberate through Brazilian society for decades, marking the end of a life and the beginning of a national reckoning. The date, December 30, 1976, became etched in Brazilian memory. The murder of Ângela Dinizs was not just another crime, it was a societal earthquake. A woman of her stature, brutally murdered by her lover, challenged the prevailing narratives of crime and punishment. This wasn't a back-alley killing, it was a domestic tragedy involving 2 prominent figures, thrust into the national spotlight. The shocking nature of the crime, coupled with Ângela's celebrity, ensured that this case would capture the imagination and ignite the fury of an entire nation. The ripple effect began immediately. Immediately after the murder, Doka Street fled the scene. He drove away from Buzios, abandoning Ângela's body in the beach house. His initial action spoke volumes about his state of mind and his attempt to escape the immediate consequences of his act. However, the weight of what he had done, and the inevitable pursuit by authorities, soon caught up with him. Within hours, Doka turned himself in to the police in the nearby town of Vitória, Espírito Santo. His surrender began the legal battle that would forever define the case and expose deep societal fault lines. The discovery of Ângela Diniz's body in her Buzios home sent shockwaves through the community and, very quickly, the entire country. The glamorous socialite, once the epitome of life and vivacity, now lay dead, a stark testament to the violent end of a tempestuous relationship. Forensic teams descended on the quiet beach house, turning a private tragedy into a public spectacle. The crime scene photographs, later released during the trials, would depict the brutal reality of her death, searing the image of a beautiful life extinguished into the national consciousness. The full horror was now undeniable. Upon his surrender, Doka Street confessed to killing Ângela Dinizs. However, his account was not a straightforward admission of guilt, but rather an attempt to justify his actions. He painted a picture of a tormented man driven to extremes by a manipulative and provocative woman. This narrative would become the cornerstone of his defense, that he had acted in legitimate defense of honor. His confession, while acknowledging the act, simultaneously shifted the blame, initiating a legal and social battle that would put not just Doka on trial, but also Ângela's character and, by extension, all women. The murder of Ângela Dinizs quickly transcended the boundaries of a typical criminal case. It became a cultural phenomenon, a focal point for debates simmering beneath Brazil's surface. On one side, traditionalists clung to patriarchal values, where a man's honor justified extreme actions. On the other, a burgeoning feminist movement saw in Ângela's death a brutal symptom of systemic violence against women. The media, both sensationalist and analytical, fanned the flames, ensuring that every detail, every rumor, and every aspect of the case was dissected by a captivated public. The stark contrast between Ângela Diniz's glamorous public image and the horrific manner of her death fueled much of the public's fascination. She was a woman who embodied a certain kind of freedom and modernity, yet she met a brutal, archaic end. This dissonance resonated deeply. Was her lifestyle an invitation to tragedy, as some argued? Or was her murder a stark warning about the dangers faced by any woman who dared to challenge societal norms? The answers people sought reflected their own deeply held beliefs, turning the trial into a mirror for Brazilian society. The first trial of Doca Street began in 1979, 3 years after Ângela's murder. The delay allowed public opinion to ferment, but also for legal strategies to solidify. The defense team, led by prominent lawyers, understood the prevailing societal norms and how to exploit them. Their goal was not to deny Doca had killed Ângela, but to justify it, to make it seem like a tragic, albeit understandable, response to her supposed provocations. This meant putting Ângela Dinizs on trial posthumously, dissecting her character, her past, and her choices under a harsh, judgmental light. Doca Street's defense rested heavily on painting Ângela Dinizs as a seductress, a manipulative woman whose promiscuity and rebellious nature drove him to a breaking point. They argued that her insistence on ending their relationship, her desire for freedom, and her past affairs amounted to an intolerable assault on Doca's honor. The legal team meticulously dismantled her reputation, turning her independence into a flaw and her assertiveness into aggression. This tactic was designed to appeal to the deeply ingrained patriarchal values of the all-male jury, diverting attention from Doca's violence. Witnesses called by the defense detailed Ângela's turbulent past, her various lovers, and her spirited personality. Each anecdote, stripped of context, was twisted to portray her as deserving of her fate. She was labeled a vamp, a loose woman, and a danger to any man who dared to love her. The courtroom became a stage for a relentless character assassination, designed to strip Ângela of her humanity and justify the ultimate act of violence against her. It was a chilling display of how societal prejudices could be weaponized in the pursuit of justice. At the heart of Doca Street's argument was the archaic concept of the legitimate defense of honor. This legal precedent, though rarely invoked, allowed a man to be acquitted or receive a lenient sentence for killing a woman if he could prove she had somehow dishonored him or his family. The defense painted Doca as a victim, driven to madness by Ângela's supposed betrayal and defiance. It was a strategy that played directly into deeply ingrained misogynistic beliefs prevalent in Brazilian society at the time, arguing that a woman's life was less valuable than a man's perceived honor. In essence, it was not Doca Street who was truly on trial for murder, but Ângela Dinizs herself. Her life, her choices, her very character were put under intense scrutiny, as if her independence somehow justified her brutal death. The prosecution, perhaps overwhelmed by the defense's powerful social narrative, struggled to shift the focus back to the crime itself. The narrative was clear: a man, provoked beyond endurance, had acted to defend his honor against a dangerous woman. This narrative resonated deeply with a significant portion of the public and, critically, with the jury. On October 19, 1979, the verdict was delivered. Doca Street was found guilty of manslaughter, but incredibly, the jury accepted the legitimate defense of honor argument, classifying his act as a privilegiado crime, a crime of privilege or lesser culpability due to extreme emotion. He received a 2-year suspended sentence, meaning he would serve virtually no time in prison. The courtroom erupted. For many, this was not justice, but a horrific endorsement of violence against women. The decision sent shockwaves of disbelief and outrage across the nation. The leniency of Doca Street's sentence ignited an unprecedented firestorm of public outrage. Women across Brazil, from all social strata, felt a profound sense of injustice. The verdict was not just about Ângela Dinizs, it was about every woman who had suffered violence, whose complaints had been dismissed, and whose lives were deemed expendable in the face of male honor. The traditional media, initially complicit in vilifying Ângela, began to shift its tone as the tide of public opinion turned forcefully against the verdict. A movement was brewing, powerful and undeniable. From the ashes of the initial verdict rose a powerful slogan that would define a generation: Quem ama não mata, who loves doesn't kill. This phrase, simple yet profound, became the rallying cry of a burgeoning feminist movement. It directly challenged the notion that violence could ever be an expression of love or a defense of honor. Women marched in the streets, demanding accountability, systemic change, and a re-evaluation of the legal framework that permitted such injustices. This wasn't merely a protest, it was a fundamental shift in Brazil's social conscience. The Dinizs case became a catalyst, mobilizing women's rights advocates across Brazil. They organized demonstrations, public debates, and advocacy campaigns, pushing for legal reforms and a profound cultural shift. Intellectuals, artists, and even some politicians joined the chorus of dissent, acknowledging the deep-seated misogyny that the verdict had exposed. The movement ensured that Ângela Dinizs' story would not be forgotten, and that her death would serve as a poignant symbol for the countless women who had suffered similar fates in silence. The nation was forced to confront its own uncomfortable truths. The relentless pressure from the Quem ama não mata movement and public outcry eventually forced the legal system to act. Prosecutors, bolstered by the shift in public sentiment, appealed the initial verdict. The demand for a new trial for Doca Street grew too loud to ignore. This was a critical moment for Brazilian jurisprudence, testing its ability to evolve beyond archaic traditions and respond to the contemporary demands for equality. The stakes were incredibly high. A second trial had the potential to either reaffirm traditional biases or set a precedent for a more equitable future. In 1981, 2 years after the initial, controversial verdict, Doca Street faced a new jury. The atmosphere in the courtroom was markedly different. The defense could no longer rely solely on the defense of honor with the same impunity. Public opinion had shifted dramatically, and the jury panel, still all male, was now under immense scrutiny. This second trial was not just a re-examination of the facts of Ângela Dinizs' murder, but a re-evaluation of what constituted justice in modern Brazil. The weight of an entire nation's expectations rested on the proceedings. This time, the prosecution approached the case with renewed vigor and a clearer understanding of the societal context. They meticulously presented the brutal facts of Ângela's murder, emphasizing the premeditation and the sheer violence of Doca's actions. They countered the character assassination, painting Ângela not as a provocateur, but as a victim striving for autonomy. The focus was firmly placed on Doca Street's culpability and the inexcusable nature of his crime, rather than on the victim's past. This strategic shift aimed to dismantle the honor defense piece by piece, challenging its very legitimacy. The second trial consciously worked to reframe the narrative, moving away from victim blaming and towards perpetrator accountability. Expert witnesses provided psychological profiles, discussing the dynamics of abusive relationships rather than fixating on Ângela's morals. The media, too, reflected this change, portraying Ângela Dinizs with more empathy and recognizing the systemic issues at play. This reframing was a direct result of the feminist movement's tireless efforts, demonstrating how public pressure can influence legal proceedings and reshape societal perceptions of justice. During the second trial, a range of expert testimonies were crucial. Psychologists offered insights into the obsessive and controlling nature of Doca Street, explaining how such personalities can escalate to violence when challenged. Forensic experts re-examined the evidence, reaffirming the brutal nature of Ângela's wounds and challenging any notion of self-defense. These testimonies helped to strip away the emotional, biased rhetoric of the first trial, grounding the proceedings in factual evidence and modern understanding of domestic violence. This factual clarity was vital for swaying the jury. The public sentiment had swung decidedly. While some traditionalists still clung to the honor defense, their voices were now largely overshadowed by the chorus demanding genuine justice. The Quem ama não mata movement had educated a significant portion of the population, raising awareness about femicide and the unacceptability of violence against women. The trial was no longer just a legal battle, but a cultural litmus test for Brazil. The world watched, eager to see if the country could prove its commitment to modern values and human rights, especially for its female citizens. As the second trial drew to a close, Doca Street made his final plea. This time, his narrative was more subdued, less focused on vilifying Ângela and more on expressing remorse, albeit still within the context of his own suffering. He maintained that he loved Ângela deeply and that the murder was a tragic outcome of an uncontrollable passion. However, the court and the public were no longer receptive to this emotional appeal. The careful, factual arguments presented by the prosecution had effectively dismantled his prior defense, leaving little room for sympathy or justification. On November 15, 1981, the jury delivered its verdict in the second trial. This time, there was no ambiguity. Raul Fernando do Amaral Street, Doca Street, was found guilty of murder. The legitimate defense of honor argument, once a shield for perpetrators, had been definitively rejected. The courtroom, filled with activists and media, erupted in cheers and tears of relief. It was a monumental victory for women's rights in Brazil, a clear statement that a woman's life and autonomy held inherent value, regardless of her personal choices or lifestyle. The scale of justice had finally tilted. Doca Street was sentenced to 15 years in prison for the murder of Ângela Dinizs. While some argued it should have been a longer term, it was a significant improvement from his previous suspended sentence. He served a substantial portion of his sentence before being released, eventually fading from the public eye. His conviction marked a turning point, signaling to Brazilian society that violence against women, particularly under the guise of honor, would no longer be tolerated or excused by the justice system. The sentence, though debated, represented a new era of accountability. After his release from prison, Doca Street largely disappeared from public life. The man who once epitomized unchecked male privilege was now a pariah, his name forever associated with one of Brazil's most infamous murders. He sought anonymity, living out his remaining years away from the spotlight he once commanded. His story served as a cautionary tale, a stark reminder of the consequences of violence and the changing social landscape. The conviction, while delayed, had effectively dismantled the legal and social legitimacy of his actions, leaving him with a tarnished legacy. The murder of Ângela Dinizs and the subsequent trials became a pivotal moment in Brazilian history. It sparked a national conversation about gender violence, machismo, and the role of women in society. The Quem Alma Neo Mata movement successfully challenged deeply entrenched patriarchal attitudes, pushing for legislative changes and cultural shifts that would protect women from similar fates. The case forced Brazil to look inward, confronting its own prejudices and working towards a more just and equitable society for all its citizens, not just the privileged few. Today, the name Ângela Dinizs remains synonymous with the fight against femicide and the struggle for women's dignity in Brazil. Her story is taught in legal and feminist studies, a powerful example of how public outcry can force legal systems to evolve. While challenges persist, the case undeniably laid crucial groundwork for greater protections for women and a shift in societal attitudes. The memory of Ângela Dinizs continues to serve as a beacon, reminding a nation of the costs of prejudice and the enduring power of collective action in the pursuit of justice. The tragic death of Ângela Dinizs was more than just a crime, it was a catalyst that propelled Brazil into a new era of social awareness. Her life, once celebrated for its glamour, became a symbol of vulnerability, strength, and ultimately, resilience. The narrative of her murder, from the initial verdict to the final conviction, exposed the fragility of justice when confronted with deeply ingrained societal biases. Yet, it also proved the immense power of a united populace to demand change, ensuring that the legacy of Ângela Dinizs would forever be intertwined with Brazil's ongoing journey toward equality and true justice for all.